Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Patria Roman-Velazquez is a senior lecturer in culture, media, and creative industries at King's College London in the United Kingdom. Mora Matassi, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University and the coordinator of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Patria in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mora will tell us more about Patria's research and career. Then Patria will present her work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Mora will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Mora, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you for having me as moderator for today's edition of the virtual seminar series. It is an absolute honor to introduce our guest speaker for today. Professor Patria Roman-Velazquez is an interdisciplinary researcher with an interest in urban communication, migrant and ethnic economies, and urban regeneration. She's a senior lecturer in culture, media, and creative industries in the Department of Culture, Media, and Creative Industries from King's College London. Professor Roman-Velazquez obtained her PhD in social sciences from the Center for Mass Communication Research at the University of Leicester, sponsored by the University of Puerto Rico's Fellowship in Urban Studies. And she also obtained her MA and her BA with honors in communication studies from the University of Puerto Rico. Patria is the author of The Making of Latin London, Salsa Music, Place and Identity, and co-author of Narratives of Migration, Relocation and Belonging, Latin Americas in London. Her work has been featured in venues such as the Journal of Urbanism, the Journal of Latin American Communication Research, and the Political Economy of Technology, Information and Culture Journal. Professor Roman-Velazquez is also the founder and chair of Latin Elephant, a charity that works with migrant and ethnic groups to increase participation in processes of urban change in London. In today's presentation, Patria will shed light on the digital strategies deployed by British Latinx populations to resist gentrification in some of London's most deprived and ethnically diverse boroughs. She will discuss how cultural symbols and practices are used as a tool to resist gentrification and as a statement for spatial justice, arguing that use of social media alone is not enough to change power relations in gentrification struggles, but that it draws attention to a range of issues around affordable housing, the loss of cultural and economic spaces for Latin Americans in London, which is a group underrepresented in media discourses in the UK. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Patria Roman-Velazquez.
Hello, thank you for that introduction and thank you for the invitation as well. Okay, I'm going to start this presentation by sort of the first half of the presentation will give a lot of background information, aware that the public is probably not aware with Latin Americans in London. And I've divided that into sort of 4 different subsections to talk about very generally about the population, a little bit about London's Latin media, and then focus a bit more on London's Latin barrios and gentrification struggles around Latin Americans in London. And the second half will then delve into issues of social protest and digital activism. In this paper, I focus on what is social and sort of digital strategies that are deployed by British sort of Latinx populations to resist gentrification in some of London's most deprived and ethnically diverse boroughs. I discuss how cultural symbols and practices are used as a tool to resist gentrification and as a statement for spatial justice. I argue that neither protest nor the use of social media alone are enough to change power relations in gentrification struggles, but that when used as part of a wider campaign, these become important tools to resist gentrification. Not only do they draw attention to a range of issues around affordable housing and the loss of cultural and economic spaces for Latin Americans in London, but contribute to make visible and sometimes rather audible British Latin American populations in the UK. I argue also that transnational networks of solidarity and local struggles over place are facilitating a renewed sense of belongingness and claim to the city. I will focus a little bit or say very briefly something about Latin Americans in London, just a little profile of the population. Latin Americans are the second fastest growing non-European population in the city, with just under, according to census data, 250,000 in the UK, of which 145,000 are based in London. Census data, of course, fails to capture the full range of experiences of Latin Americans in London and in the United Kingdom in general. The studies that you see in the screen at the moment were very much crucial for subsequent sort of research, all of which demonstrated that despite being a well-educated population, many were unable to fulfill their expectations regarding sort of job security, housing, and other socioeconomic opportunities. As with other migrant groups, many Latin Americans in London live with immigration status insecurity, under precarious and overcrowding housing conditions, job insecurity, exploitation and multiple shifts, language barriers, and lack of access to health services and other government resources. And the titles of these reports and studies very much capture the trajectory of Latin Americans in London, from largely an invisible community, as I described them in my first book, The Making of Latin London, to no longer invisible, towards visibility, and then the case for London's Latin Quarter captures the trajectory of a long history of, or relatively young in comparison to the States, of Latin Americans in London. And also very briefly as a context, I want to say something about London's sort of Latinx media in the UK and well in London, but following a very similar situation to the groups that, that they serve, the UK sort of Latin media remains very much an unexplored area of study. There are no consistent sort of archives or specialist collections of Latinx media in the UK, with exception perhaps of the British Newspaper Library, but one would need to know the name first in order to find it, which makes it very difficult to produce an accurate picture of their emergence and their continuity. In my latest book with Jessica Retis, we attempted to map Latin media in the UK, aware of all the limitations and the ephemerality of these ethnic media outlets. Despite what we noticed was that there was a big correlation with population growth and commercial growth, that Latin media is very much part of another set of businesses within the UK sort of ecosystem. They are basically a publicity outlet as well for Latin American owned businesses and services. They support or they provide support to community organizations, and they are an outlet for self-representation. Despite this, Latin media and digital platforms are more likely to remain invisible. And over the last decade, what we've observed is that Latin media have fluctuated between sort of big rapid growth, but also significant sort of contraction. There has been a tendency to diversify media platforms, and rather than emerging with new one is that diversification of the same ones in different sort of platforms. And also there's a lot of business or specialist sort of magazines, but not necessarily news magazines. And the news magazines or the newspapers are most concentrated in very few hands and very few owners that tend to then diversify. And I will now sort of focus a bit on the use of this digital sort of spaces, media spaces, to resist gentrification in one of London's sort of largest Latin barrios. But, you know, first I want to tell you a bit more about where are these Latin barrios. In this photo, you see photos, you know, from the bottom left, which are the first attempts to the first shops that open in the Elephant and Castle shopping centre, to more modern or recent developments, and also the faces and the people behind these shops. One of the first barrios is in the Elephant and Castle area of southern London. It's a very central location geographically. There are around sort of 100 shops there, and this is the longest and the sort of largest Latin American business cluster. One of the things that we've sort of found here is that there are 4 clusters within that sort of very condensed sort of area, and that 41% to 44% are women business owners, which we thought that was quite interesting as well. And a large proportion of the business owners are identify themselves as being from Colombia. The other area, or the other barrio, which is more towards North London, is Seven Sisters Indoor Market, in the area that is called Seven Sisters, in a building that is locally known as Ward's Corner building. This building has been closed since the pandemic in March 2020, and it did not reopen. The managers decided not to reopen it on health and safety grounds. They've had a long battle to save this place, and a campaign to save this place. Here, 20 of 39 shops in that building, or in that sort of indoor market, 23 were owned or leased by sort of Latin American retailers. The other area, which I call sort of Brazil London because it's mostly dominated by Brazilians in London, is an area in Northwest London called Brent. And here we found around 33 to 35 Brazilian owned shops in that area. What these 3 areas have, or 3 predominantly sort of Latin American sort of business clusters have, is that they are in boroughs that are very much unequal sort of boroughs. The proportion of the population that identifies having a migrant and ethnic background is over 40%. They are the center of ambitious programs of regeneration, and they are home to the largest concentration of Latin American businesses in London. The growth of these Latin American retailers in this location has led to the development of what are very Latin, sort of distinctively Latin areas in London with very particular type of identities. And elsewhere, you know, I discussed this trajectory, how this trajectory has contributed to a form of localized sort of Latin urbanism that I call, but I'll leave that for another time. All these barrios, as I said, are very much under threat because of a process of retail gentrification that sees Latin American and other migrant and ethnic traders fighting for the right to a place and culture. I want to now move a little bit more around the issues of gentrification and activism. So regeneration is taking place in some of London's most deprived and ethnically diverse boroughs. And it is against this backdrop that British Latino populations are feeling the brunt of gentrification more than ever. It is in this context that I tend to focus on the strategies deployed by community campaigning groups to resist gentrification processes. There is very little understanding of how Black, Asian, minority ethnic, and other sort of racialized groups organize and campaign around issues of gentrification, particularly so in the United Kingdom. Grassroots groups and voluntary sector organizations are very much trusted by the communities within which they work. They can scrutinize developers' plans. They produce evidence to convince the authorities of the impact that gentrification will have upon the neighborhoods and livelihoods. They also advocate for a community-led sort of regeneration that is much more just and that it's inclusive. And they tend to be sort of regarded by the local authorities as radicals, and their evidence tends to be dismissed as anecdotal. So the level playing field here is very unequal. So the gulf between land as an economic resource worth exploiting and land as a community asset reduces opportunities for dialogue and engagement of grassroots groups in the planning process. Participation in the planning process is either patchy or rejected altogether. The choice between protest and participation in the planning process leads to new forms of urban activism where rights, culture, and identity take center stage in claims over the right to the city. I would like to sort of move a little bit more now into what were these digital strategies deployed by community campaign groups in response to gentrification process. However, as I noted at the beginning of this presentation, an active use of and a presence in digital spaces is one of the many tools and strategies deployed by community groups, and one which sits between protest and participation. I argue that protest and the use of social media alone are not enough to change power relations in gentrification struggles, but it does provide opportunities, and here I'm quoting, for disadvantaged groups to self-represent themselves, communicate independently, and organize transnationally. To address this issue, I focus on the campaign to save London's Latin Quarter at Elephant and Castle. The area is called Elephant and Castle, and it was dominated by that statue there and that shopping center that you see in the slide. So Elephant and Castle is home to the largest Latin American business clusters. This predominantly Latin American business cluster shares the space with other migrant and ethnic groups. They are under threat because of a retail gentrification that will see Latin American and other migrant groups fighting for the right to remain, but also to remain in place, but also remain sustainable in the area. The growth of British sort of Latin-owned shops at Elephant and Castle since the opening of its very first shop, La Fogata, in 1992 has been quite exponential. At the very beginning, there were around 22 shops in the area when I first did my research in the 1990s. In 2020, the number of Latin American shops around the area is over 110. The British sort of Latin presence in the Elephant and Castle core area comprises of these 4 sort of areas, which is the shopping center, which is no longer there. And then we see the empty space on the right-hand side, and where the places have been relocated. That shopping center was demolished in September 2020. And so this is the sort of condensed area within which Latin Americans are. So the shopping center disappeared, but the other areas remain. But as with everything, when one area increases value, then there is a risk of displacement for the other traders around. And the next map shows the different sort of shops that have been sort of relocated as well. Where is Elephant and Castle? Elephant and Castle is in Southwark. Southwark is also the borough with the second highest number of Latin Americans in the area, with 8.9% sort of representing the total of the population, right, of Latin Americans, which represents 8.9% of the total population. As you can see, this is very central. There's a very central area in London, is in zone 1 in terms of transport, which makes it really central. You are like 30 minutes walk at the most from the Houses of Parliament, London Bridge, about 20 minutes walk, and so on. So really it's geographically very central, but economically quite marginal. The area has been earmarked for regeneration for a very long time, and has attracted the attention of developers who wish to invest in transforming the area's economic and demographic sort of mix to maximize return in their investment. These are photos of the shopping center that has been sort of demolished. So they're sort of now old photos. This has been the case, for example, with the developer at the heart of this development, which is Delancey. They want to transform the area, Elephant and Castle, into what is a new town center. The images that you see here are the relocation spaces that have been won as part of the campaign for some of the traders that were in the shopping center. The shopping center would have been to the right of the station that you see there, the station sign that you see there. And the new sort of town center offers all of those things that you want to do. You can see in that sort of slide. However, the two that I want to highlight here is the sort of units that are socially rented and the 10% affordable retail space, partly because the number of socially rented housing and affordable retail space were concessions gained by the local campaign groups, with Latin Elephant and 35% campaign playing a very crucial role in the position and the committee sort of hearings. The redevelopment plans for Elephant and Castle can be traced back to 1991 and was received with skepticism by retailers of Latin American background, who, despite welcoming a lot of the changes, feared for their sustainability and also their future presence of their businesses in that area, which meant then the future presence as well of the communities in that area. Elephant and Castle's planning application was submitted by the developer in December 2016. And not only were the visions emerging from the consultation with traders that we did, it was not only not policy compliant, but it ignored the visions of the traders. Oppositions to the plans were soon made. Leading the opposition were 35% campaign on housing matters and Latin Elephant and migrant and ethnic business and inequality issues. From the very beginning, the demands were for the application to be policy compliant, but most importantly, because it had a negative impact upon Latin Americans and other minoritized and racialized groups. And this came in their own equalities assessment research that they did and reports that they did. Local opposition gathered momentum, and in November of 2017, the Up the Elephant coalition was formed in many migrant and ethnic and economically disadvantaged groups who felt alienated by the consultation process and the proposed development, sort of participated in the protests, in the activities organized by the campaign. The campaign is formed of many grassroots organizations that were working for a better deal for the communities of Elephant and Castle. The campaign brought together demands by local residents and traders in a concerted effort to resist gentrification. And I think this is quite interesting here that housing and residential demands were sort of united with the commercial demands as well. There was a strong sort of recognition of the contribution that Latin Americans had in Elephant and Castle, but also of the role that traders play in the area and for the campaign. For example, on the day that the planning application was going to be heard, the streets from Elephant and Castle all the way up to Southern Council offices were sort of filled with protesters chanting Delancey to the bin and holding placards and messages such as "We're here to stay," "We love the elephant," "Homes for people, not for profit," "Protect our barrios," "Stop the displacement of migrant and ethnic traders," and so on. Protesters of the Elephant and Castle development joined the symbolic salsa dance lesson, the anti-gentrification bingo game, because there was a bingo in the shopping center. And this is a clear example of how cultural practices not only shape a neighborhood's identity, but how they're used as a tool to resist gentrification. Cultural symbols and practices are used to assert rights over space. Equality matters, I argue, were taken out into the streets in a symbolic performance that translated into a statement for equality and spatial justice. This was also the case in Seven Sisters, and the image you see here now is the salsa and samba shutdown at Seven Sisters, which is now sadly closed. So social media played an important campaign in mobilizing sympathizers across London and coordinating process and other collective sort of actions. It mobilized those who opposed to the development, including local residents, traders and staff and students, also from the sort of London College of Communication, which is the local university that partnered with the developer. So you had university lecturers, lawyers, unions, general public, all campaigning against this development, and also campaign groups across sort of London. Social media was also a very great tool for scrutinizing the process, particularly when response from local government officials, for example, were scant. The slide that you see here shows a sort of Twitter trail from Latin Elephant that presented evidence and demanded answers about the lack of relocation sites for all those traders that would be displaced of the Elephant and Castle shopping center. And this was resorted when when all emails and other forms of communication failed. So this strategy resulted in a quick either Twitter response, an email, or a follow-up meeting with all the other sort of counselors and developers, for example. So social media was used to scrutinize the regeneration process and to also promote the research and evidence that was gathered by these organizations. Many of these groups are resource poor and are dependent upon volunteers who collaborate with their skills in advancing the campaign's demands. This was the case as well with another person who collaborated with the organization, which was called Petite Elephant, and with the campaign, who's an architect who produced the research and all the data and evidence that Latin Elephant needed to make arguments about the lack of affordable relocation sites and the number of traders that were to become destitute. And this is research that was invaluable for our demands. And this demonstrates that social media is a vehicle for greater engagement and accountability of a process that is complemented with rigorous research. The social media presence of the campaign was organized around 3 key demands, each with a set of requests, and which is what you can see now in the slide. It also gained the international, and these demands were very much amplified by all members of the sort of the Elephant Coalition and campaign, and with other sympathizers. It was a very sort of concerted sort of message and focused message here. We also gain, or the campaign also gained attention of international, regional, local, ethnic media, with live tweets, for example, on the planning, on the days where the planning sessions were being aired by a local sort of SE1, which is a postcode for media platforms. And so in this respect, in this respect, social media enabled activists to sort of mediate and frame goals slightly more easily. The group and members of the coalition play to each other's strengths to build a social movement. And this is included, as I said, opposition to the planning committee meetings with councillors. 14 councillors signed and circulated a letter, for example, against the development. It involved meetings with planning and regeneration teams in the council, in the mayor's office. There was a strong media campaign. There were meetings with local groups, with traders, petitions, stalls to reach those who wouldn't get social media, for example, messages either. It involved the occupation of the London College of Communication. It involved street protests. It was a multi sort of faceted campaign strategy in which all local groups shared knowledge, skills, and strength. And basically the message was to ensure that the development not only should be policy compliant, but also that it brought benefits to the local population. 1 year of campaigning and formal opposition and writing and so on led to various gains, which you can see in this sort of infographics that was produced for the organization. Probably, I'm not going to list them here, but you can sort of go to the website perhaps and sort of see it. But it seems insignificant in comparison with the amount of money that the development is costing. But this was a significant achievement because we started with zero, right, with nothing. So to have the lease extended for 15 years and the affordable rent was a great gain. To get a relocation package was a great gain, and so on, right? So the study has demonstrated how this campaign has been more than just about protest and activism. The campaign aligns with a form of mediated activism that included a range of public issues that go beyond ideological underpinnings and objectives. And as such, it used a series of media tools to amplify the campaign's goals. Social media was a link in a chain of events and strategies that drew attention to a range of issues around affordable housing and the loss of cultural and economic spaces. Media presence alone is not enough to achieve any form of social change. Digital activism is just one aspect of campaigning. Digital activism goes in tandem with protest and participation of transnational diasporas in their plight to resist gentrification. Thus, I argue that mediated activism can achieve social change through its capacity to become multidimensional and highly networked. The context of, and I'm rounding up now, the context of urban gentrification has exacerbated urban inequalities and power struggles over place and identity. However, under these circumstances, it has also strengthened community ties and a sense of solidarity amongst the urban poor, migrant, and ethnic groups. Strategic alliances are formed at times of extreme uncertainty. And when economically powerful institutions like developers, for example, and a frail local authority whose economic power has been diminished, but which retains its planning powers, then community campaigns gain momentum. different roles are played out and enacted by different community groups, and an alliance built around common grounds begin to emerge. Campaign groups gained momentum and took all in its stride to challenge developers' plans that were not only economically overpowering and unequal, but with racial undertones. Social and spatial justice are at the core of community grassroots campaigns across London. And so I argue that developer-led gentrification supported by local governments and sympathetic social enterprises is the antithesis of spatial justice and will be met with resistance by local groups and ongoing campaigns striving for social and spatial equality. And la lucha por el derecho a la ciudad continúa. I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Professor Patria, for this super insightful and important presentation of this really, yes, important topic and pressing topic. I have many questions, and I do know that Pablo and Facundo have questions too, but I first want to remind our audience that there's a Q&A box in the bottom of the Zoom webinar that they can leave questions there, and I will be happy to share them with you, Professor Patria. I have two questions to start with. The first one, and both are kind of connected in a way. The first one might sound counterintuitive and is related to the idea that certain social media platforms, and I'm thinking specifically of Instagram, can actually have a gentrifying effect on some areas. And this, again, this is counterintuitive. I don't think that this is the case in your case study, but I wonder whether you have reflected on this. I know that there, for instance, I'm thinking about certain parts of Los Angeles in the United States that became, you know, these milestones for Instagrammers or for places that every influencer has to take a picture at, right? And then over time, they become insanely gentrifying, you know, and this is an effect of the use of social media per se. So that's question number one. So I think whether there's any reflection on that. Maybe this is crazy, but maybe it's not, maybe it's something that happens. And then my second question also has a sort of cross-platform perspective. And it's about, what do you think that certain platforms can do for mediated activism that some others cannot do? So you mentioned, for instance, Twitter in your case study. And I do see how Twitter has this very informative aspect to it and this community engaging and community engagement perspective to it. And that's something that I don't see perhaps in other platforms. And finally, okay, I will add the third question. I promise that I will end there. But finally, you mentioned that social media, the use of social media as caused by efforts against gentrification ends up creating networking within the community itself. Are there people that are left outside of those networking or those network effects of the use of social media for activism? That is, maybe some people from the community are not using Twitter, maybe they're using WhatsApp, but they're not using Twitter or Instagram. So what happens with that? And again, this is kind of cross-platform in the sense that I'm asking, maybe some platforms have more effect on something and some others no. So yeah, those are my three questions, kind of interrelated, and I will stop there because I know that there are other questions too. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, they're all very interesting questions actually, and some of which I've reflected on and some of which I haven't. The thing that you said about how social media per se can contribute itself, you know, to gentrification struggles, it's not the way we've used it, but yes, it can become like that, and it can. And also a lot of the time I reflect on the same work that we do at Latin Elephant, and in what way also us promoting the area as a Latin quarter, which comes anyway from what we've done with the traders, contributes to that, right? In what way we're contributing to its own demise by calling it Latin Quarter, whereby then you'll end up with, yeah, loads of Latin American shops and not necessarily with a Latin American person behind it, right? Or in the ownership of it, or a very different and gentrified Latin American sort of neighborhood, which is what I fear might happen in Elephant and Castle, for example. It's not the way we have used social media. Social media has been to amplify messages of the campaign in that respect, right? It hasn't been, we came to Instagram quite late as well. So we mainly depended upon Facebook and Twitter. But yeah, because Instagram is images, it does have that could contribute to that, but it's something that we might also want to reflect upon in certain ways. In terms of, there was a question here about mediated activism and the sort of role that different platforms play. And I do think different platforms have different sort of audiences and different, in terms of not just whether they're more professional, less professional, whether they're more community-based, but also age range and so on. So we do have, as part of the campaign, work in all sorts of different platforms and websites and so on, partly because of that, and the sort of responses we get in Facebook and the responses we get in Twitter, or who our audiences are very different. Twitter is much more professional, for example, and so on. So, you know, local councillors will immediately respond. They don't want that public outcry, and we had a lot of followers in terms of Latin Elephant. Facebook is less like that. It's more the community, right, and so on. So there are differences. So that's why we sort of diversify the messages across different communities. And there's also another important part that perhaps I didn't highlight so much here, but, you know, protests were a way of reaching the larger community that we don't reach in social media, right? Even though in a way protests were also advertised through social media, but there was also stalls that some of the Elephant sort of campaign groups put these tables on a Saturday morning, afternoon, in front of the Elephant and Castle, leafleting, talking to people who social media, you know, who would not reach by social media. So that's why I'm saying the campaign was so broad and encompassing so many other sort of aspects. And again, many of the traders themselves do not use social media at all, right? They did not have Facebook pages. The one that was more social media savvy was using Facebook, not Instagram, not Twitter, nothing. It was with the pandemic that changed a little bit. And the way that the organization Latin Elephant communicates is through WhatsApp a lot of the time, or Zoom meetings with them now.
Interesting. Professor Patria, we have two questions from Facundo, so he will activate his camera and ask them himself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roman, for this very interesting presentation. I have, well, maybe the second question is related to where we were just talking about, but I will start with my first question. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned issues of trust and senses of lack of justice, or I would say like lack of trust. And I'm curious about what you think about if this lack of trust or this lack of justice is in your fieldwork something that drives this this motivation or like this engagement and activism. And at the same time, if this activism or this advocacy that these communities are doing are sources for rebuilding trust. And I'm thinking trust in two ways: trust as a community level, like an interpersonal trust within a particular community, but also trust in a, I would say, hierarchical or vertical way, like with governments, with other institutions, with other companies, for instance. So my question is, how do you see trust in this interconnection? And my second one is, maybe you could say that this is already answered, but I'm curious anyways to ask about the role of generations in this activism, because it's usually like the literature on like activism and digital activism usually says that younger, more politically active, usually more high socioeconomic status people tend to participate and engage more in digital activism. And I'm curious if is that the same case that you study, or if it's different? And I also, in some way, you reflect on this based on like the difference across platforms. But anyways, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those two questions. Yeah, trust is really important, and lack of trust in the entire process. Trust at the level of the community and the community of traders was really important. The way we gain trust, or Latin Elephant gained trust with the traders was over years. So we've been there since 2014 working, or me as an academic before then, right? And then the organization develops and bringing people from the, to work in the organization and so on. It's like an NGO, a charity, they call it here, an NGO. And that cementing work was really, really important. And the traders, we gained the trust from the traders, and they trusted us. And that to us was really, really important. And we were also a bridge of communication, right? We were not there just to represent the traders, but it was also, no, you come to those meetings with the developers, you come to those meetings and explain the situation and so on. So there was a lot built around that as well, so they could trust us with them being representing themselves in these really tense sometimes meetings. And also we needed to gain trust as well in the community. These is, Elephant and Castle is, even though I was a researcher, Elephant and Castle is an area that is been going through this process of regeneration for long, and campaigns were around a housing estate called the Haygate Estate that was demolished in 2011 or so. So the struggles are very cemented there as well. So we also needed to gain trust, even though some people knew me, they didn't know the organization and what we stood for. So it was trust in terms of that level of the community, and we did gain it. But also lack of trust in the developers and the profit aspect of it. And lack of trust of politicians, for example, for which broken promises a lot of the times were happening. Lack of trust on the political sort of government that is leading the particular borough councils as well. So basically, what you tend to have is that lack of trust and disengagement in a way with them. That's what I talked about, this between protest and participation. That tension was always there. So it's between protesting in the streets and doing that, and then participating in the systems that are also trying to dismantle you in your communities, right? So that idea of protest and participation for me was really important in this level of activism. So there I was protesting, and there I was presenting to the committee at the same time. And there I was presenting responses to the planning, right? And opposition to the planning in the form one, and using the systems. So it was about how you use every single tool at your hands in that respect. But it's also because of that lack of trust on that people tend to resort to protest or to these other forms of digital activism. And in terms of the intergenerational aspect, it's really interesting because some of them, you see the one in Seven Sisters is very young, sort of, and there's a sort of Latinx sort of group, very active, very politically involved in all of these struggles and really committed to this. And that tends to be quite younger generations. But the Elephant and Castle, some of the issues that revolved around was also equalities impact assessment around not just race, but also gender and age. And this because there was a bingo hole in there. And this was used by a lot of minority ethnic sort of groups of the older population. And within the impact assessment, they said, these are the groups that are going to be impacted the most. So they were also going out, a bus, like the bingo hole owner at one point said, okay, well, I'll get a bus to take all my clients there, right, to the protest and so on. So it was a way of trying to be inclusive and include almost everyone. And yes, it was intergenerational. And I think the fact that it crossed platforms digitally, but non-digitally as well, allow for that, and the fact that many people were impacted by the development.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Patria, Professor Boczkowski has a question. He will ask it now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mora. Thank you, Patria, for a truly fascinating seminar. I have many questions, but I'll start with three and group them in different categories. The first one is we might call a methodology question. You were a researcher and also you were involved as an activist. You still are, right? So I wonder if you can reflect on, the embodiment of these two roles and what you see are some of the consequences of your identities, in this case, playing out both on the research side and on the activist side, right? So that's one first sort of category of questions. The second one is what we might call the comparative angle. You mentioned in your talk that, the prevalence in one case of a lot of Colombians, right, in the market, and then you also mentioned, an enclave of Brazilians, right? So I wonder if you could reflect on issues having to do with intra-Latin patterns. These are different communities with different histories, for instance, different issues of histories of race relations. Brazil being the country outside of Africa where there is the largest proportion of population of African descent in the world, right? 56% of Brazilians self-identify as people of color. Colombia, there is a significant proportion, in particular in the Caribbean side of Colombia, but it's not nearly as large, right? And I'm sure there are other populations also, from more Central America, etc. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that, and also broadening the scope of comparisons, relationships in this kind of phenomenon of gentrification with other ethnic groups in London. And also what you might have seen from research about gentrification and ethnicity in other big metropolis in the world where we've seen this playing out. So different layers, if you wish, of comparison, intra-Latin, inter-ethnic within London, international, right? And then finally, I was really struck by your elaborations at the end, your reflections of mediated on issues of mediated activism and the role of social media, the role of traditional media. So it's a picture of The Guardian amplifying a performance protest, right? That I'm sure there was a lot of communication about that protest on social media before, during, and after. So I wonder if you could comment on the sort of, if you wish, the feedback loops or the dynamics across traditional and social media. Mora focused more on the sort of across different platforms. So I was wondering, the sort of mediated side cutting across traditional and social, what you saw.
Yeah. Okay. I could be another hour here talking, but yes, the role of being a sort of activist but a scholar at the same time. I have a piece in progress reflecting about this, and some of it is sort of coming in an article on Latin urbanism soon, but not all the reflection is there. But I do reflect on that role of the activist scholar, for example, or the scholar activist, and what am I? I am very sensitive to the fact that a lot of this information, is very public, and that I participated in behind the scene meetings at times, but I wasn't there as a researcher, so I would never use, there's an ethical dimension there, I would never use any of that at all, but I use what's publicly available, right, in that respect, in issues about the campaign. And I have done, of course, also research on this, in the more sort of traditional sort of way, but I've been following up this developments studiously, right, since 2006, and it involves, looking at planning documents, it involves all sorts of things. But yeah, my identity plays out quite a lot because I'm a migrant, I'm a migrant woman of color in this country, and that really plays out a lot. My family migrated to the United States when I was little, and we lived in very poor neighborhoods in New York. And I know what it is to live, and I identify with those courses, and the courses that I choose to sort of engage with and represent and research are very much part of my own heritage and of my own experience. So that explains why I'm so involved in this. And this is not just my research, but it's also part of the belief system in that respect. My identity as a scholar, in a way, is interesting because the responses I get from counselors and from developers, it's quite interesting, and they will engage with me, but they will not engage with so-and-so, and explicitly said so. Or other people working in Latin Elephant would email so-and-so and they never replied, but I think you need to intercede here now. I sent the email and they reply, right? So there are issues there about status and how people see who they engage and not engage with. I don't know how to play that out, but I know it works in certain ways. So I suppose we play that if any other resource sort of fails in that respect. And also at the very beginning of the organization, up to 2016, I was the front sort of face and doing all of that work. I've left academia at that point. But yeah, it is something that I'm reflecting upon. I keep reflecting upon. In terms of the intra-Latin sort of patterns, there is a lot of that happening here in terms of race and ethnicity, in gender, around also nationalities and against nationalities within the same country representation. This is not a unified community at all. And this very sadly played out and is playing out in the Seven Sisters case, in which it's not just about race or nationality, it's also about party politics that are played out in the field here, right? Divisions across groups that represent different political factions within Colombia, right? And that is played out, and it's a big sort of internal dispute as well. So yes, it's not a unified community. However, like I said, or I tried to say that, the role that Latin Americans play, because they are quite numerous in terms of their businesses in these sites, they are part of wider campaigns that include other ethnic groups and other local groups in all the strata in terms of class and ethnicity and so on. So it played a big role in saying, okay, let's unite, because it's that struggle. So it wasn't that the Latin Americans were all united against this. Some people are quite happy to see these places go because they identify this with it's a poor place, and we don't identify with those places. So there wasn't a unified, concerted voice coming from the Latin American community itself, right? It was a particular section of the Latin American community or communities and their counterparts in terms of ethnicity. And the other thing on traditional and new media and cutting across, I suppose we just use all the strategies that we had at our disposal in a way, but also because it is a really big development and it was in the news all the time. So if it was played, for example, in BBC news, London news, then it will capture, I mean, it started in the local ethnic media, they see it, BBC London covers it, then the main sort of news covers it, then the World Service within BBC will see it, then CNN within the international will see it, and so on. And also there's a journalist here that is a correspondent for N24, which is a Colombian news outlet and channel. So as well, it made news over there, right? And so on. So there's all these ways in which media was sort of used. And here, you know, we're very in the organization fortunate to have a person who did a degree in political communication, so knew as well how to how to use this as a disposal. And everyone chipped in as well. It wasn't just Latin Elephant, it was all the other organizations as well. I hope I answer, yeah.
Oh, excellent. You answered it perfectly. We are right on time, 3 seconds to go until the very end. So thank you, Mora, for your terrific moderation. Thank you, Professor Patria Roman-Velazquez, for a fabulous and very, very timely seminar. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end. And I invite everybody to join us again next Thursday for a new installment of the virtual seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you again, Patria. This was fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you very much.